these truths to be self-evident.
That all men are created equal.
As a member of Congress, I get to have a lot of really interesting people in the office, experts on what they're talking about.
This is the podcast
for insights into the issues.
China, bioterrorism, Medicare for all, in-depth discussions.
Breaking it down into simple terms. We hold
these truths.
With Dan Crenshaw.
The Eagle has landed.
Welcome back, folks. Look, it's no secret that Americans are divided today, not just politically and who they vote for, but even on what type of news they consume or how they consume it. The latter affects the former, as we've seen increasingly over the last several years. It seems to have reached a pivotal point where Americans simply won't believe actual facts if it's being reported by a media outlet they don't like. It's become so divided that journalists don't want to accurately portray both sides of the story and label conservatives threats to democracy or spreaders of misinformation for just asking questions of our liberal counterparts. This is not normal, nor is it healthy. We're going to ask, can the mainstream media dig itself out of this grave? Can it regain the trust it once held many decades ago, or will we continue to spiral? And on a similar note, will America's electoral system regain the trust of voters through maybe something like ranked choice voting? Or will its complex nature and unintentional outcomes harm our election process? Instead, are we looking for the right solutions in the right places? And to help us with that conversation today, we're honored to have Wall Street Journal editorial board member Kim Strassel with us, who I think can shed a lot of light on the uproar over ranked choice voting happening in her home state of Alaska, and of course, liberal bias happening in the media, or bias of all angles. I think we're going to have a great, just generally political science-y kind of conversation. Kim, thanks so much for being on.
Thanks for having me, Congressman.
So, as I was talking to you before we started recording, the episode prior to yours with Nick Troina he was making a really strong case for ranked choice voting, and I pushed back on a number of things, and I got to admit he had pretty good answers for my concerns, which I think I share a lot of the concerns that you have, but he did make a good case, and I try to be open to good cases. Sometimes too, you just got to see how this works out in practice. Which you have seen, of course, in Alaska, and you don't seem to like it very much, do you?
No, I do not. And let me just try to explain why from a very broad perspective. So if you look over almost all of the history of the United States and the way most of our elections are run now at the federal level and in most states, we have long had a definition of a winner, okay? The winner is a person who has the majority support of the voters. Now, maybe not always the majority, that has the most support, I should say. Often it's a majority, sometimes it's a plurality, but that's the winner. And that's what we think of as the winner. The problem with ranked choice voting, in my view, is that it fundamentally is changing the definition of the winner. Okay, the winner is now not the person who has the most voters' support, but rather the winner is the person who is most acceptable to the most number of people. All right. And if that is what you really want, that's one thing. I don't think that most Americans understand that is what this system does, though. So that's my mechanical kind of ideological problem. Now, let me just add my political issue. If you look at who is pushing this most, it's almost all groups that are center or center-left, liberal outfits. Now ask yourself, when they say, and they're very open about this, that they want a consensus candidate, that they want a more moderate candidate. If you're a liberal, what's your definition of a more consensus moderate candidate? Someone who is not conservative. And that is why you are now seeing groups push this very hard in conservative states. And it's how in a place like Alaska, where Donald Trump won by 10 points, you have a Democratic congressperson who just got elected.
Well, I want to ask you about what the next election will look like with her, but something you said stuck out to me, that what you said that what the outcome tends to be was the most acceptable candidate to the most amount of people, which you got to admit, a lot of Americans would hear that and be like, yeah, exactly, that's what I want.
Yeah, I don't know that most Americans do want that, though. Do you want the mushy middle candidate? Do you want the one that just because you couldn't get the person you really want is just your second or third choice? Because that's the way this ballot system is set up to do. It forces you, if you want to be part of it, you put your first choice down, the person you're really excited about. But then you say, well, if I really can't have that person, I guess this is my second choice, or I guess this is my third choice. And the whole system is designed to penalize those that are the first choice votes and in fact to reward people who are second or third on everyone's list.
Yeah. Yeah. But I mean, well, as far as what would people say, look, I mean, the people who show up to Republican Party meetings, anytime I put on a political event, the people who actually show up to those things, they eat, sleep, and breathe politics for the most part. They would absolutely say, no, they do not want the mushy candidate, right? That's like, it makes them crazy to even think of it. So yes, you're right about them, but a lot of other people who don't necessarily show up to those meetings, but I meet in every other walk of life, say exactly that, right? They almost use those words exactly. Like, I just want somebody who kind of compromise and see both sides and et cetera. And even I tell them, I'm like, well, I'm not that person for you. just to be clear. And they're like, well, I like you. And I'm like, and so my way of convincing them is, what you like about me maybe is my tone, and maybe that's what you're looking for. And because you mentioned, again, before we started recording, like, this is, maybe we all agree on the problem, but maybe this structural change, you argue, is not, it's not quite the solution to the problem that we all agree on. Which is maybe a lack of decency in politics.
Yeah, I mean, this is my problem, is it's a wholesale transformation of a voting system. Okay. And again, fundamentally shifting what we're doing. What in my mind is actually a solution, and that's what we're imposing as a solution to, fundamentally, is a cultural and societal problem. Like, if we want better candidates running, let's have better candidates running. Let's reward those who are doing a better job. One of the problems with this, and I can just tell you, you say a lot of people really like this. I can promise you that the majority of Alaskans are not thrilled with what just happened in this election, because if you look at the system, again, this is a state went 10 points for Donald Trump. Okay. And if you look at the first round of voting in our special election, there were 2 Republicans on the ballot and 1 Democrat. 60% of voters voted in that first round for a GOP candidate. But because of the vagaries of this system, and it's all set up, we now have this open primary and 4 people advance out of that. Pretty much no one can ever get 50% in the first round. And so in this case, we only had 3 people on the ballot. One of them went away, which was a conservative. And because a lot of people chose to protest and not vote the second time, it's very coercive. It was just enough sort of second votes in the end to put the Democrat over the edge. And so you have a state that's very conservative.
But it is telling.
And no one's happy with this outcome.
Well, we say it's very conservative, but it's kind of telling that there's a good deal of voters that voted, instead of marking their first 2 choices Republican, they marked 1 Republican and another Democrat. So the vast majority of people, so the way it worked is Nick Begich took 3rd. Okay, so think of it this way. Just do the math. 60% of the state conservative, 40% not. So the Democrat got 40% of the vote. Okay. Nick Begich took 3rd. He was one of the Republicans. And the vast majority of his second votes went to Sarah Palin, the other conservative, but just the tiniest enough was there to push a Democrat over the 50% mark. Right. Yeah, I know. I get it. It just feels like
it feels a little rigged. It is a little rigged. In fact, it is rigged. It's designed to come up with that result.
So what's going to happen on Tuesday? They still have to have another election, don't they?
Yeah, so that was their special election. Mary Patola, the Democrat, won it. It's only for a few months to finish out this year. Now we're going to have the regular election for what happens for the next 2 years. I guess you're going to see the Republican Party in Alaska has been spending a lot of money to try to educate voters on how this works, with this new point about rank the red, because it's true that if all of the people who had chosen not to rank a second person had indeed voted for the conservative, you probably wouldn't have had that result. So this is entirely going to be a question of how much education is done and how many people choose to now partake in the system, even though a lot of people are protesting it and therefore not marking a second choice.
So who are the front runners right now? Because I mean, isn't it also true that Sarah Palin wasn't very popular in this election? Does that have a lot to do with it?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, but that's kind of interesting too. Like, she took 2nd. right? And the
Yeah.
majority of Begich's voters put her as their second choice. So yeah, the question is, is she a little bit more controversial in the state? Possibly so. But does that mean that if you would put her straight up against Mary Patola that she wouldn't win? I'm pretty sure she would.
Yeah. Well, and like it's like you said, we should just have better candidates that more people like.
Right.
That would be nice. And we'll get to that, like, because I've got thoughts on that as well. But I am just legitimately curious so who are currently the front runners in this for Tuesday's election? Like, what do you think will happen?
It's the same crew of people.
Same crew. Okay.
Yeah, it's the same crew. So we're just doing a repeat. It was pretty much the same thing happened. Although this time there was the first time around, one of the candidates who advanced from the primary withdrew, and the Board of Elections said you couldn't have a replacement. Now we've had a new round, and again, someone withdrew, but they did allow, so there's like another sort of conservative on the ballot as well too. We'll see if that sort of makes some sort of difference, but it's pretty much, it's again, Patola, Sarah Palin, and Nick Begich Jr.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes it's growing pains with like a new system, because I tend to, the reason I just admit I'm just not super passionate about this particular issue one way or the other.
I am.
I know. And well, because I just tend to think that, look, as long as we're all playing in the same system, it's generally fair. Like, campaign finance rules, term limits, electioneering, whatever the rules are. If we're all playing by them, we're playing by them. And, that's what I tend to think. I don't know. Maybe that's,
I guess I understand that, but I totally understand that point. I think that's reality, as long as everybody else understands what they're signing up for.
Yeah.
And, and I think that was part of the anger of everything.
It was too complicated.
Well, it's not just that, but the way this was an initiative on a ballot 2 years ago. It was funded by all kinds of outside money from outside left-leaning organizations, and they were very deceptive. The initiative was 25 pages long, single type. And the beginning of it all led with, this initiative will get rid of dark money in elections. Yeah. And way down in the garble, it said, oh, and we're going to completely throw out your whole voting system and change it over.
Yeah.
Even then, it only passed by like 2,000 votes, but a lot of people didn't realize what they were signing up for, and there's likely going to be another initiative, and it could well go away because it's that unpopular.
Like, what did the dark money have to do with anything? What did they get rid of?
It didn't. I mean, that was the point, is it sounded good. They led with that. All the campaign literature that came out saying vote yes on this said get rid of dark money in elections. But they weren't honest about what was really happening with it.
Did they like ban super PACs or what?
It was complicated. I'm still not even entirely sure. It's more about transparency as to who's spending and what you have to disclose. Yeah.
Sure. People don't realize that you do have to disclose it. I think C4s, that one, there's like one entity that you can donate to as a donor that is undisclosed, but it can't actually support a particular candidate. People don't quite realize that.
It can only support issues. Yeah.
I mean, it kind of gets to this whole conversation about like, okay, how do you make things better? And people are always looking for these structural answers to making things better. Ranked choice voting is one idea. And people talk about gerrymandering all the time, or term limits. And I'm like, but I'm not sure it works. Again, either we play by the same rules, and we fight to win within those rules. Democrats destroyed Republicans in the 2018 election by doing ballot harvesting, because it was legal there. And then Republicans took it back to them. Like, they figured out the system, and maybe that's what happens in Alaska this time. We were a little slow to the first move. But I'm curious what you think about the gerrymandering debate, because while I don't like how it works, I'm also not sure what a better option would be. I always tell people, I'm like, you find me this perfect computer algorithm that creates the most fair possible voting, like district lines that you think represent people the best possible way. And I guarantee you can't do it. And so it'll always be a subjective political decision, just how our founders intended it. I think they argued about this quite a bit, and eventually settled on this kind of imperfect but most perfect sort of solution. Now, that doesn't mean that it doesn't create polarization. I mean, obviously, very red districts and very blue districts, the incumbents running there have zero inclination to talk to, even if it's like 40% of their voter population. It's not insignificant, but it's insignificant in terms of winning an election.
Right.
But it's not insignificant in terms of people, just in what people think and what matters to them. And there's no incentive to cater to that at all. And I think that frustrates people. I'm not sure what the solution is there, but
I think I'm going to say two things that are going to sound completely at odds with each other. But first of all, I did agree with you. Gerrymandering is a huge problem. I think it's very corrosive to our system, but I also don't think it's imperfect in this regard, in that the founders, when they set it up, the one thing that they did make sure, and this is why state legislatures get to do these maps, is that it means that the people who are doing it are accountable to the voters. And by the way, if you don't like what they're doing, throw the bums out and demand a different system. Now, my problem is I think a lot of people aren't top mind focused on gerrymandering when they go and cast their vote. But if it becomes an egregious enough problem, that could change. The solution that, again, a lot of people have put forward is to do some sort of imposed structural change to this problem. And often what it's ended up in several states is to have these supposedly independent commissions that are going to, in a very enlightened fashion, come up with a better map than your elected representative. The problem is, again, totally unaccountable. If you don't like that map, how do you get rid of those people?
right.
How do you hold them to account?
Yeah.
And again, right now, at the moment, gerrymandering is something you and I are talking about. Maybe it's not motivating every voter, but if it becomes a big enough issue, there is a remedy for it existing right now in the system that we have.
Yeah, you vote them out.
Vote them out. Vote them out, and elect someone who actually says, one of my primary things I'm going to do when I get elected to your state legislature is make sure that we have less complicated, stupid looking electoral maps.
My district was strange looking, to say the least. It had nothing to do with me, even though I got tweeted at it for. I was tweeted at a lot for it. It doesn't matter. It now looks more normal in my new district, more like a pond instead of a river running through Houston. But in the end, it's like, but I always said, I'm like, okay, like, what don't you like? I ask people, because I like to have these sort of thought experiments. Like, let's make this an academic discussion. Tell me what it is you don't like about it. Well, it's corrupt. Why is it corrupt? I mean, look at the shape. So the shape is the primary indicator of corruption. Yeah. Why? I don't know. You know what I mean? So in this, it doesn't start to make sense, because I'm like, well, I mean, maybe that's the case. It strings together all these different neighborhoods. So let's look at the ethnic breakdown. The ethnic breakdown, turns out, my old district was like pretty well balanced. I mean, it looked exactly like Texas. I think it was almost perfectly proportioned. It was like 35% white, 30% Hispanic, 12% black. I don't remember off the top of my head, but it was very well balanced. Socioeconomically, you could argue it was also pretty well balanced. It was a close district. It was not obvious that Republicans were going to keep winning that. It's one of the reasons. Maybe there was a lot of retirements then. I won by less than 5 points my first election. People got to know me a little bit better. I did a little bit better in 2020, but still, it was a very purple district. And so, I think these political science conversations are interesting, because I think people just get really emotional about some of this stuff and they don't know why. And I'm like, what is it that's really getting at you? Is it just the shape? Because now I have a district that's completely uncompetitive. There's zero chance that a Democrat has any shot, but it looks better. So is that less corrupt, or is it more corrupt, or is corrupt even the right word? I don't know. Maybe I'm being too Socratic with my.
No. I mean, but I think it's really interesting. Like, when I've talked to people, same thing, and I think that one of the things that in the average American's minds, and I really connect with this, is that when they see a shape, any kind of funny shape, the assumption, and I get it, is that it was done for some sort of partisan political gain, to sort of, or in chasing some kind of outcome, like you said, where you want a perfectly proportioned district. And I think in most Americans' minds, their argument is, why do we not just have a series of blocks across the state? And, you fall where you will, and then let's see where it goes. And I think a lot of Americans don't understand why the sort of obsessive efforts that go into these maps every year. Just divide the state up in a whole bunch of sort of, straight old blocks, and let's go for it.
They don't realize it's population based either. So like every district has to have the exact same population. I think it's like 760,000. And so that creates complications. That's why we do a census. I mean, there is a lot that goes into it. And, is it fair or not fair? I'm not even sure that's the right question, but because it sort of just is. And nobody has a better solution. Like you said, oh yeah, you could have a council of wise men, but who are they accountable to? But what about term limits? What do you think about term limits?
So, that's another one that years ago, in particular, the conservative movement, this was a big priority in an attempt. In my mind, I would love to have a political class. Again, an idea that was about imposing a solution to a problem, right? I would love to see a political class that was more like one of my favorite senators, Tom Coburn, who said, I'm going to run this many terms, and then I'm going to go back into private life. Because that's the kind of, in my mind, again, what our founders sort of believed, which was that you were going to have citizen legislators.
Yeah.
They were going to come in, they were going to benefit the country with their wisdom from all the different walks of life that they came from. And Coburn was a great example. He was an obstetrician. You come in, and by the way, that was amazing. He almost single-handedly educated so many of his Republican colleagues on healthcare policy, an issue they didn't want to touch, which, by the way, is one reason we have Obamacare, because conservatives just kept saying, I don't want to touch that issue. And he's like, we got to embrace this, folks, and come up with some solutions. He did. Then he went back into private life. I'd love to see that happen more. And I think that politicians who made those kind of pledges would really satisfy a hunger and a need for a lot of voters out there. They'd like to see that happen. But, we got guys who've been in the Senate now for longer than I've been alive. So, and that's part of the system. So it's part of the problem with the system. So I guess you could have term limits that imposed it, but I'd like to, again, my baseline solution is always, let's have voters demand a little bit more, and let's get a better class of people running out there.
Yeah, just raise our standards in general. Because the thing is like, I'll ask people, okay, you want term limits? Yes. You want me to leave Congress next year? Well, no. I want Pelosi to. Well, who do you think is going to replace Pelosi? Yeah. Some nice moderate lady that you're just a big fan of, or is it going to be some like
in San Francisco?
No, it's going to be some like blue-haired crazy person that identifies as a dolphin on weekends. Like, I mean, it seems. And so, I always tell people, like, it feels good, probably not going to solve any of your problems. And I like some of these old guys in Congress. They know things. It's the thing about governing too, is it has gotten very complex, and we sort of idealize this notion of citizen legislators that come and can offer their expertise and then leave. But the truth of the matter is, it takes a while for anyone to really understand policy, and also governing frameworks and just basic civics. There's a lot of ignorance, unfortunately, in Congress. But I guess it gets to your main point, which is just have higher standards for God's sakes. And so that maybe is another question, which is like the status of our parties. I always hear people derisively say or refer to the establishment, whether Democrats or Republicans, the establishment. And I'm always like, where is this establishment? Where can I find this establishment that has so much power, to hold us to standards in the party, to develop a platform, where to fund opponents or fund allies? Where is this establishment? I don't see it. It doesn't really exist. That's the honest truth. I think my personal opinion is the problem is we don't actually have an establishment. And so that what we have then is sort of these factions that are often motivated by a crap ton of emotion. that can then that can then swing political parties. The political parties are not suited to deal with that. I look at the Texas convention, the state convention that we had. A lot of good people came to that, but a lot of people came there just to be disruptors. A lot of members, including myself, were accosted, attacked. John Cornyn was screamed at incessantly, and it was like, this is so juvenile. This does not look like a room full of adults who are serious about the future of their country. This looks juvenile. I don't care how mad you are. Screaming at the top of your lungs during a speech makes you look like an idiot. I do not care how mad at you. I'm sorry. I have zero compassion for overly emotional people. Maybe it's because I come from the SEAL teams and we just can't deal with that stuff because that'll get you killed. And so I think politics is a very serious business, and I don't like people turning it into a WWF match. Anyway.
But you're talking about a problem in institutions in general. I mean, you can apply that to parties, and I completely agree with you. But look at the leaders of our, cabinet at the moment. Look at the leaders of where the FBI has taken us in recent years. So much of what we're dealing with in the country would be different if we had people setting examples, good examples. I mean, we're having a discussion right now in the country about political violence. All right. And the targeting of prominent politicians or their husbands or their families. And part of that comes from the fact that we do not have enough leaders that are simply willing to talk dispassionately about, by the way, be passionate if you want, about policy issues. They have lost the ability to do that and not connect it to some sort of moral failing or personal. They make it all personal.
Yeah.
If you don't agree with me on
it's
the
good versus evil
that I have, you are somehow a threat to democracy. You're bad. You're a bad person. You're an immoral person. That is what really inspires rage and political furies. And you end up with speeches like that. We need to be able to go into a room and say, like, okay, here's my position on guns. Here's your position on guns. Make your case for why, we should have more legislation, and I'll tell you my case for why we shouldn't.
Right.
But without saying, if you don't agree with me, you believe in murdering people.
Yeah.
That's crazy. And that is where we are in too many debates that we have in society these days. And it's amplified by other very toxic sort of forces like the misuse of social media. Social media can be a great thing. The fact that we're doing this right now is great. But if you're using these channels instead to spread more of that vitriol rather than using it to educate, get facts out, that's a problem.
It's a problem, and it's almost an unsolvable one until the market for it deteriorates, right? And until people stop demanding it and stop demanding those clicks. And yeah, that's this is something I tell people all the time who have all of these frustrations, and I'm like, look. I know you want to blame politicians for it. I know you want to blame Washington and Congress, but it's a reflection of the American people, whether you like it or not. They're responding to incentives, whether you like it or not. The flamethrowers up there that you despise or love, depending on, but they're just responding to incentives. And until we sort of demilitarize our political conversations, for lack of a better term, it's or de-Kardashianize our political conversations, because it does feel like more like a Kardashian, like Jerry Springer WWF show, and like save that passion for, your sports team. Because that's when you're supposed to like dress up in face paint and like scream at your opponents and yell these slogans. Like that's why we do it. Like sports has like a very, there's some deep anthropological, roots in sporting events. Like it allows us to fight because it's a very innate kind of tribal thing that we need to do, but without the violence. And politics is also kind of supposed to be that. It's a little bit more of how we're supposed to disagree on serious matters without the violence. And we're turning it into sports, and sports can but that's like warfare. That really is a you versus me kind of thing. And we're really teetering on the edge there. And yeah, you see it in these little instances of political violence. Now, granted, usually it's some dramatically crazy person. I would like to think that we're still not very close to this, some of the left say it, some of the right say it, this like civil war. I really don't think that's the case, but people are led to believe it because of social media. I tell people, like, stop looking at social media for 30 days, talk to normal people.
Yes.
Just go out, just be out in the
Right.
world, and you'll think America's cool again. Trust me.
Yes.
Like, because most people are just
Because
like,
it is cool.
it is cool. Yeah. It's
Yeah.
cool.
And, you know, I love your analogy of sports, because when you apply that to politics, here's the problem with sports. There's a flat out winner and a flat out loser. And we can't look at our political system that way. That's one of the things that we've lost, is that, you know, we need to be returning to a time where people, yes, win or lose elections, but when they come to Washington, their goal is to advance the country as a whole. They do not sit in Washington simply to pummel their opponents and make them lose. Or, you know, declare like victory in the end zone by passing something that completely shut out the other side from any discussion. That's what Americans are getting a little bit sick of. And, you know, you just brought up something else that's important. You keep talking about the sort of flamethrowers. Why do we hear so much from the flamethrowers? And this gets into your opening thing, because the media is now incentivized to highlight the flamethrowers all the time. You know, in the wake of that attack on Pelosi's husband, there were any number of responsible people that had the right thing to say about political violence, and they didn't get really any of the headlines. You got the, you know, the few crazies over here or here that were making the really partisan polarized points, and they suck up all the media and all the attention.
Yeah. And, you know, like, whose fault is that?
The media.
The media. Yeah. I'm just like, and part of me wanted to say just like everybody, because the thing is, the media does it because they know everybody will click on it.
Right.
You know,
Well,
it's about clickbait. And I point this problem out on the, as far as right-wing media goes, all the time, which is, you know, people start to mistrust their major media institutions. You know, whether in your mainstream ones like Fox and Wall Street Journal or National Review, or maybe they've never even heard of them. And so they end up in these sort of kind of dark corners of the internet. And that frightens me a little bit, because I'm like, I don't know why you trust this person. They're just telling you some kind of crazy narrative that you want to hear. They think you want to hear. It's provocative. It's sensational. And we've attached some sort of value to that, like this, like moral good, because they're the ones who are brave enough to say it. And I was like, where's the bravery here? It's like some 22-year-old just trying to get clicks, who works for some obscure website that's just like, you know, dragging you down this rabbit hole. And I'm like, look how easy this is, because I'll give you 5 articles. One is, you know, Pelosi stock trades, she's corrupt. Number 2 is, you know, Biden gaffes again. Biden sucks at the economy. Number 3 is 5 reasons why Dan Crenshaw is a globalist rhino. Well, like, which one are you going to click on? Like, obviously, especially as a right winger, like you're going to click on that one. And it's like, the grift is so obvious at this point. You know, and I just try to tell people, like, stop reading some of this stuff, or just, you know, be able to discern what's real and what isn't. What I don't know if you have anything to say about that, but I was going to ask you about, you know, the main point we've been sort of dancing around, which is how you actually elect just better people, whether to lead the institutions that we've lost trust in. Those aren't necessarily elected positions, but just our politicians in general, so that we don't have to go down these rabbit holes thinking about how to make these drastic changes to our electoral systems.
I keep waiting and hoping. It's funny, this has been on my mind a lot lately, because I've been thinking about kind of the future of some of the parties, and especially after this election. And I'm also writing a book on a topic, but I keep waiting on one side or the other, because again, I think this comes down to leadership, and the fact that if the people at the top are putting forward a certain message and behaving in a certain responsible way, the incredible impact that can have going down the line. And I keep wondering why we haven't had like a return of like a Reagan to lead a party lately. You know, if you go back and you look at Ronald Reagan, he did not win because he was pummeling his opponents. He did not win by engaging in impeachment hearings in the House and kind of retributive politics back and forth. He didn't win by bashing on his fellow conservatives. Reagan's 11th commandment was, "Thou shalt not speak ill of another Republican." He won by having an incredibly optimistic, encouraging, uplifting view of where this country could be, of inviting everyone to come along and join in that vision with him, of using humor and of communicating his ideas. I mean, how hard is that actually? Apparently it's very, very hard. I guess it's just too hard. And we've had a number of politicians on both sides who instead the path to victory in their mind is how bad can you demean the other side? Can you use the same tactics they did? Let's destroy our institutions a little faster. They did it to us, so we're going to do it to them. One thing I'm really hopeful, I really hope this is true. I saw an interview the other day, Steve Scalise, if Republicans take the House, he was talking about how one of the first things that you guys really want to do is restore some regular order, have people go back into committees and put forward legislation and mark it up and have debates and actually kind of try to move some stuff. We've got so much dysfunction and so many levels of everything at the moment. But this is what Americans are craving, someone who's going to explain how you get stuff done, invite people to come along, and be optimistic about America's future. And I just don't see enough of that on either side.
Yeah, and primaries have changed too. I mean, this comes down to primaries, and the tone has changed in these primaries since I first ran in 2018 versus what I saw in 2020 and then 2022. Like the standard of what is acceptable as far as how far right or how far left you can go has changed dramatically. Not 9 people running for basically a safe Republican seat in 2018. Didn't seem to me like anybody was running real far out to the right of each other. There wasn't anybody in that race who I would describe as a con artist or just kind of this sort of jobless hack who had figured out that if they tweeted the right things that they could get some attention. Which is vastly different than what I saw in 2022, where like that exact kind of person was, well, not only my primary opponent, but many primary opponents. Now, do they get a whole lot of traction in the end? No, but the fact that they even make a blip on the radar is a little bit frightening, and it just makes me wonder, like what people are craving, what they're reading, what is happening here, and sometimes they win. That's the thing. I mean, sometimes they actually win. And I'm not sure there's an obvious way to change that. But I mean, I guess the best we can do is put out information about, I think, what conservatism is. And this is why I like reading the Journal, and why I tell people, look, when they ask, where do I find real news, Dan? I'm like, look, Wall Street Journal, National Review. I like the Daily Wire. I like Ben Shapiro. These are your conservatives that will tell you the truth,
right?
Not tell you how it is, okay? Because that's what I hear a lot too. Like, no, he says it how it is. He's saying it how you want to hear it,
right?
Based on a certain narrative. That's not necessarily truth. Truth is sometimes telling you something you don't want to hear. Maybe when somebody does do that, maybe you should listen to them a little harder, because maybe they actually care about you.
Yeah.
I say sometimes we should maybe treat the American people like we actually love them. Because if you don't like your kids very much, you tell them what they want to hear. You tell them there's no consequences. You tell them they're always right and that somebody else is always wrong, and that's why their lot in life is the way it is. That's what you would tell your kids if you didn't love them. But that's.
Let me ask you a question, because you were talking about your primaries. What do you think could be done to change that dynamic a little bit? Like, for instance, so one thing I saw, I remember some of the headlines that came out of the Pennsylvania Senate primary, which was, a pileup. There was a lot of candidates in there, and they were splitting the vote on the Republican side. And there was some criticism afterward saying, the party should have played a bigger role, at least at the front end. And, there has been historically an argument that parties are there to help kind of vet candidates, make sure that they're ready for prime time? Is there some bigger role for primaries, or how do you, I mean, for parties and primaries, how do you end up with a situation that isn't like what you just saw?
Oh, I think there should be. I mean, look, if we're going to rail against the establishment, let's actually have an establishment.
Have one? Yes,
yeah, I mean, might as well have
exactly.
one. And, you know, because I think people envision like this sort of council of elders that that would vet candidates and help the right candidates. And, you know, why doesn't like the Republican Party officially put out its recommendations? Now be careful what you wish for, of course, because again, in some states, the quote unquote party has been taken over by you know, very few people that maybe don't represent the base. This is another thing. Like I hear like the base wants this. I always hear this from activists. The base is, you're not listening to the base.
Right.
Well, are you the base? Is it just you? Because I can put you in a room with 20 other Republicans, and you guys will all have different opinions on maybe how we should approach a given issue. So don't call yourself the base. You're not the people, right? There's a lot of people, and I think regular Republicans, who I guess you would consider the base, if we're being technical about it, that means they vote in every primary. And but tell you what, that's tens of thousands of people just in any given district, and they're not all coming to the meetings. Like they're not all precinct chairs. They're not all engaging in party politics. So you know, when I was complaining a minute ago about the state convention, where it was just a circus, it was, you know, that granted, again, a very small minority of the people there created that circus. But even that's the tiniest of minorities of the entire base, as we would describe the base. And the thing is the rest of them probably don't show up because they've gotten used to seeing that kind of disruption. They've gotten used to seeing that kind of behavior, or the obsession with, say, like a conspiracy here, a conspiracy there. And they're like, wait, this isn't serious. And so I have other things to do on my evenings. I'm not going to go to this meeting anymore. And so then you see a party that eventually just gets taken over by not the base, but by a very, very tiny fraction of it. Now, again, I'd say for the most part, that turns out okay, but it does depend on the state. I do tend to think in redder states, it's actually somewhat healthier. I think Texas is generally healthy in that regard, not with all groups. Sometimes I see groups that are like way out there, but I see it. I can see it go real bad in very blue states sometimes, like I like, for instance, I know the Young Republicans of New York have a very different division from, say, the Republican Party of New York.
Right.
They're very different. You're probably familiar with all of that, being working for Wall Street Journal, maybe being somewhat familiar with New York politics, but it can just go a lot of different directions.
Well, you know, the other thing too is then you also have to look at the entire category of voters, by the way, which are the majority, who aren't engaged in any of that at all. Yeah. And this is one of my other kind of enduring sort of frustrations, is that, you know, I think some of us who are on the conservative side, we talk a lot about principles that matter deeply to this great American project, one of which is federalism. And yet we don't do enough sometimes to encourage people to actually embrace it. You know, I go out and I give speeches and I talk to these people and they spend all day long, you know, watching television, cable news, and focus on Washington, D.C. You know, what are you, Dan Crenshaw, doing in Washington, D.C., and what's the president doing and the White House doing and everything? And they go, look at all these problems. Like, what do we do? What do we do to stop this? And I say, go to your local school board meeting. Yeah. You know, make sure you know who is running to represent you in your state legislature, and both in your assembly and in your Senate. You know, go to your city council meetings, because, by the way, too, like you're talking about parties, this is where often a lot of people begin their political careers. And to the extent that voters are engaged in that front end, that kind of, you know, the closest bit of politics to them, and are trying to get better candidates, we're going to get better ones who end up in DC as well, too. But you have to be engaged. The things, and by the way, also, why wouldn't you? These are the things that affect 90% of your day-to-day life, right?
Yeah.
Far more so than, and not in any way to demean you and your job, but far more so than a lot of stuff that's happening in Washington every day.
Well, I mean, I would say that's a piece of good news, by the way, because I think people are way more involved in the last couple of years. Maybe it's COVID probably had a lot to do with that.
Schools, lockdowns, yeah.
I mean, there's in Harris County where I'm at right now. It's by far the thing everybody talks about is these local races with the county judge and all the judges underneath that, because crime is the number one issue.
That's great.
And these school board elections are high on everybody's mind too. Before I let you go too, I wanted to hit on the topic of just general media bias. And, I don't know, maybe what it even means to have media bias. Some people say they want just the news. Some people say they want a very boring Walter Cronkite, like these are the facts of what happened. We will give you no additional analysis besides that. And I'm not sure the Wall Street Journal is unbiased. That doesn't mean it's bad news, right? And so, like, editorial board clearly leans conservative, and I don't think it doesn't really try to hide that fact. It's not quite natural.
We are very transparent about it on purpose. We want you to know you're reading an opinion piece, as by contrast to something that's not in the opinion section.
Yeah. And so is that the right way to do it? I mean, and is that what went wrong over the last couple decades, where the lines between opinion and just the news have been blurred so much that nobody trusts anything anymore?
So there's an actual really fascinating structural change that is getting to what you're talking about, which I do agree with you was the beginning of some problems. And it was this: if you think about it, you go back 20, 30 years prior to the internet, prior to social media, your news was what you either got on television before you went to bed at night, or it showed up in a newspaper on your front doorstep the next morning. And it was therefore much easier for news outlets to simply give you the facts, because the facts were new to you. They were like, wow, this is value. Like, I've got all these new facts and I didn't have them 10 minutes ago before the news boy came along. Once you could get all that information online instantaneously, all of these media outfits had to ask themselves, well, what's our added value at this point? Yeah. And they began to do analysis. Okay. And the problem with that is that the line between analysis and opinion is very thin at times, right? So I think that is one problem that you've had, is that some organizations probably take it a little bit too far in terms of analysis. But I think that started it in my mind, and I can talk about this for ages. I won't bore you to death, but the bigger problem is not that. The bigger problem, and it's really been over the last 6-7 years, it's been frightening for me to watch, is that I have always believed that there was a little bit of liberal bias in the mainstream media. And that's in part because of the people who are attracted to the job. Especially a lot of people are like, going to save the world with my journalism. They tend to sort of lean left. A lot of them all come from the same parts of America. They go to the same colleges together. They have the same worldview. And the way I used to sort of explain it is almost like they were biased, but they didn't even really realize it, because everyone they knew thought the same way they did, right?
Yeah.
That is fundamentally different from what we saw happen starting about 6 or 7 years ago. I'd really peg it to the election of Donald Trump, where the media decided that they were going to take a political side. They openly know that they're taking a political side, and they're doing so because they've told themselves that it's essential that they do so to save democracy. That is a frightening change. It's been an overthrow of basic journalism standards. It's how you end up with all these kind of nightmare things like this 3-year baloney that was the Russia collusion scandal. Yeah. Because if you've told yourself that you're out to save democracy and that one side is bad, then you allow yourself to start breaking all these basic journalism rules. Like, no, you don't go call the guy who was fired from the FBI and use him as your main source for all this information and justify everything he did. There's a reason he was canned.
Right. Or if you're the FBI agent, you don't use those sources for your FISA warrant. I mean, it's,
correct, right.
And therefore discredit your entire institution for years to come. I mean, it's a fight we're having now, because like I try to be nuanced in how I look at, the problems. And ask me about the FBI and the military, and I'm like, look, there's problems. I'm not sure that the problem is what the sensationalist headline says the problem is.
Correct.
Doesn't mean there's not problems, but the main problem is that we don't trust them, even when we should, because we can't fall into what is effectively some kind of cognitive dissonance where we see one bad action and therefore we assume that the rest of the actions are also bad and corrupt, and like that's a logical fallacy. That can't be true. We got to be better at analyzing things, and we're not. I think one of the problems we've kind of touched on social media, but one thing I want to say about social media is I'm not sure it's been a net benefit for us, just as a human race. There's some nice parts to it, but what it's fundamentally done to politics is allowed some of the misinformation, wrong, just false narratives, conspiracies, bad ideas find each other much easier than before. And, because the truth of the matter is, if you don't have social media and you're forced to, interact with human beings, God forbid, there's a socialization that occurs. This is you become normalized by your peers in a way, because they might disagree with you. They might look at you funny when you say something that is funny or crazy. Online, that doesn't happen, and online you can not only find the people who agree with you, but a lot of them. And some of them are just there for shits and giggles, to be perfectly honest. Like, it's a lot of these young guys, especially, like, probably don't believe half the crap they say, but they love being muckrakers. They love just being out there saying stuff. And then there's like others who are influenced by that. And, and I'm like, man, it's the most unpatriotic thing you can do, which is like be part of this problem in our politics and turning it into this Jerry Springer show. It's, that was my whole point against that Alex Stein nerd who accosted me multiple times. I'm like, he doesn't probably believe half the crap he says. It's hard for me to fathom that he does, right? Like that he believes 9/11 didn't happen, all this stuff. Like it's very much an act meant for provocation. And I'm like, but are you proud of yourself? I mean, are you really, like, this is bad. It's bad for our country. Like, there's other ways to provoke that are funny, like Dave Chappelle. Like, I mean, there's just better ways to do it. So I don't know. It's just people need to, what the problem is they lack that creativity and talent. And so they make up for it with that oversized provocation and meanness. And it's not something we should reward,
No. And it used to be that, if you wanted to be that provocateur, you could go take your soapbox and stand in the town square. And if you were really nutty, people ignored you, walked past you. But now, as you said, social media has provided you a bigger soapbox, and other people from all over the world, there might only be like 1% of them, but 1% of the whole world adds up. And they're the ones that are willing to listen to you. And suddenly you have a following. And it just didn't used to happen that way.
I got a question for you, kind of random. I like to, people listening maybe want to work at the Wall Street Journal someday. And I am kind of curious how, I don't know if you are ever involved in the interview process. I imagine you must have been at some point in your long career there, or at least know how it works. But I'm curious how you assess new journalists and how you assess, especially the way they think, because I'm fascinated by how people think and like how they approach problems, how they frame it. I'm fascinated by that because I think it's the essence of conservatism, right? I tell people, look, conservatism is how you solve problems. And I think sometimes conservatives get way too obsessed with like, for instance, it's time to shrink government. I'm like, well, yeah, I do agree with that. However, let's not forget the whole point of shrinking government, which is we tend to believe that a smaller government in these areas will lead to the actual outcomes we want. And don't forget what those outcomes are. It's life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. It's They wrote it down. It was like the first thing they wrote, right in the beginning, the Declaration of Independence, why government exists, to protect your life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And if a little bit of government action succeeds in those things, then it's okay. You got to remember that. And so anyway, that's just a sort of an example. It was sort of a thought I had today. And I honestly, I just wanted to say it, but I'm curious how you guys, think about that, how you assess, because I do believe one of the biggest problems we face is that Americans are having trouble analyzing and discerning information that's placed in front of them because there's maybe too much of it. They don't trust it anymore, whatever the case may be. And at a place like the Wall Street Journal, which is, you know, the pinnacle of standards on journalism, how do you guys suss that out?
Well, let me be clear that I can only speak to the editorial side of the paper. You know, we have a very strong divide between the news side and the editorial. I did start off working on the news side. I was one of the rare people who actually asked to move to the editorial page. I think they were so surprised I did. They just hired me. But that was a very long time ago. I mean, but here's a couple of the cool things. I mean, one thing, though, that I do know is the same on the editorial page is on the news side, and why I love working for the Wall Street Journal and its editorial pages. We consider ourselves a reported editorial page, meaning it is not our job to just pontificate, to say, you know, here's an idea, and if you don't think this way, you're not thinking right. We try to give people information, right? And again, much as you're talking about, like, give them information that they can then use to make their own judgments and their own decisions. As an editorial page, we often try to give them a framework around which they can think about it. And so when we have new people coming in, we want to make sure that they know something about the craft of journalism. That they're willing to get on the phone and ask people who know a lot more about stuff than the average journalist does to fill them in and explain to them policy or explain to them the politics of a situation so that we can be accurate when we're relaying all that to people and trying to give people information. Look, the average person, and you know this, you talk to them all the time, they're busy with life, with jobs, with running a business, you know, and some of us, myself included, have the luxury of our job being to watch Washington. So my job is to try to decode that and give people the information they need. So we're looking for that in reporters. And also, I mean, and our editorial writers, our younger ones. But the other reason I love the Journal too, and I think gets to your point about kind of nuance and solving problems, is the editorial board operates under the philosophy, and it's a motto we've had for a long time: free markets, free people. And we generally, you know, like to hire people who hold those very overarching views. Now, does that lock you into anything? No, in a way, it's kind of great, right? Is that there's a lot of different ways to get to free markets and free people, and there's a lot of debates to be had about that. But generally, those are the viewpoints, and those are two of the things that I've always loved about the editorial pages. We're consistent on a philosophy, or at least I hope we always are. I feel as we always are. And we are in the job of educating and giving people more information about politics and policy, and then letting them go out there and have their own civil debates over the best direction for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Well, like how would a young person who aspires to be you one day? I mean, where should they start? I'm kind of ignorant on the entire career path of journalism. Is it just getting writing out there? I mean, I would assume that's like the first step, just having enough writing samples that somebody like you can look at and say, you know what, this person actually gets it.
Absolutely. Having something that you've written, and by the way, it doesn't necessarily have to be in a flagship outlet, right?
Right.
Maybe you've been in college working for your college newspaper, okay? Maybe you're working for the local community newspaper in your hometown. But those writing samples should show two things. One, that you know how to report an issue, think it through, present it, and two, that you have some basic ability to get words onto paper in a way that people can actually read, right? And by the way, that's a really important thing. And sadly, becoming a bigger issue as we look at some of these national test scores, it's becoming, kids are struggling to learn how to write and to write effectively and write well.
Well, this is terrifying. That's terrifying because I'll quote Jordan Peterson. I assume you know and probably like Jordan Peterson.
Yeah.
But he says something and he says it often, and it really struck me. And it was, you can't distinguish writing from thinking. Correct. And I think that's true, because look, I can think deeply about a subject, but I'm not really, it's scattered, you know, it's a mix of like imagery and words, and if I'm really going to say something, if I'm going to really think through something, I do have to write it down. I probably don't do that enough. I wish I journaled. I don't journal, but I would like to think that I'd have a really good one if I did.
Yeah.
But I try to write. I've tried to get back into more op-eds. Wall Street Journal was kind enough to publish one of mine just last week. But that so it's frightening to think then that if writing is really that bad, then it follows that perhaps our ability to think through things is equally bad.
Right.
And that's not good for America.
No, and scatterbrained, and also another small thing, but to be able to write logically and write coherently and to write briefly and get your point across, right? I mean, the other, it kind of kills me is, online space is great. You can go for 6,000 words, but you can say 6,000 words and not have any of them mean anything. There's certain discipline to actually being able to get an idea across in a specific amount of space.
And our kids being taught that, and I don't know what the curriculum, I'm assuming it's the same as when I grew up, right? It's like, let's say you want to make a persuasive argument. You have sort of the three arguments. You tell them what you're going to tell them, three arguments, tell them what you told them. Pretty simple, but it almost doesn't seem like that kind of analysis is working anymore. I mean, to kids, I'm sure kids still have debate clubs. I'm sure it depends on the school.
Yes.
I just don't know. But it's frightening to think of.
I think we have certain schools that are doing a really good job, but unfortunately, I think we have huge swaths of educational systems that are doing a horrific job. And that's the problem, is that, a lot of middle-class parents, especially if they have the ability to sort of choose where they're going to live and the place they're going to buy their house, they do that because they know that they're moving into an adequate or good school system. But this gets back to my whole kind of school choice thing, is that we need to be giving those parents that don't have that economic luxury the same opportunity for their kids to learn to do the most basic and important skills.
Oh yeah, I mean, it's 100% true. What do you just kind of a general question? I mean, what are you most worried about with the conservatives, in the Republican Party? We will take the majority. I think we're all more and more optimistic about, obviously optimistic about the House, but I mean, so optimistic now that maybe we might even have some really good numbers here in November. I'm optimistic about the Senate. It's going to be real close, but I am optimistic about it. What would the editorial board say? What would you say about what our priorities should be? How we should conduct ourselves? And more importantly, this is something I say all the time, like, we're winning this election because the other side is really, really bad. They're really, really bad. And our priorities tend to be the basics. That's the whole point of conservatism, right? It's like this sort of security blanket for you, whether that's border security, financial security, economic security, foreign policy security, crime security. I just like the word security as it relates to energy security, energy that turns on when you need it at a price that you can kind of predict over the next year. Like, when things are bad, the basics sound pretty good to people. And that's generally what conservatives stand for. Our priorities are very well aligned with the polling of when surveyed Americans are asked what their priorities are. So we're going to do well. But we got to keep doing well. You can't just win the majority once. You've got to keep winning it, increasing it, and also sustaining it for a prolonged period of time. And we haven't been that successful in doing that. And you mentioned it before, how Reagan inspired. I say this all the time. I think we talked about it when I visited the board, which was, we're going to win this election off the backs of bad Democrat incompetence, but we could win the next 10 with inspiration and happy warrior optimism easily, especially because the left has no chance, I think, of coming back to any sense of normalcy. So what do you think about that? Where should we go, and what are our pitfalls?
So here's what I hope doesn't happen, and we kind of touched on this earlier, is that there's going to be a lot of pent-up demand among some factions for what I call retribution politics.
Oh yeah.
And I think that's just a race to the bottom, and it's very damaging to our institutions. The fact that Nancy Pelosi refused to seat Republicans was wrong. Now Republicans are going to have to decide if they're going to do the same thing back. The fact that she wouldn't allow McCarthy to seat his people on the January 6th committee. Okay, there's going to have to be a decision about that. There's going to have to be a big decision about what's the balance between appropriate oversight and kind of crazy sort of nonstop all day long investigations. A little kind of anecdote. I was out giving a speech a couple of months ago. And somebody actually stood up in the questions and answers in the end and said, could you go back to Washington and please tell everybody there that we actually don't want investigations. We just want them to govern. And like half the people in the audience stood up and clapped. It was really it was quite a remarkable thing, because you'd think that, and these were very engaged conservative voters. They just want to see everybody do something. And so then on the doing something, return to regular order, show everybody that Congress can actually work the way it was supposed to work, instead of having leaders writing bills that get released and everybody is expected to vote on them 5 minutes after they hit the floor. Maybe have some debates that people can watch, and then ideas and an agenda. And on the issues, like not dodging the stuff that really, really matters. I know nobody wants to talk about Social Security. I know nobody wants to talk about Medicare, but if you think that we can all just do this and hope they all get solved some way down the road, that's not going to happen. So people want to see that. Yeah, I know it's scary, but that kind of a stuff. And also, I guess you guys are going to have to manage expectations in the beginning, because there are going to be limits to what you can actually do to fix things when Biden is in the White House. But I think if you have some sort of sensible, understandable goals, and if nothing else, to just stop sign, no more spending. And that's one more thing. The only thing Republicans have been able to do just about as good as Democrats have in the last couple of years is spend everybody's tax dollars, and that's going to have to stop at some point.
Yeah, and I do think it will. It'll decrease dramatically. And now, you said Democrats have been trying to hammer us hard on the Social Security Medicare thing. Interestingly enough, because it's never even been mentioned by a Republican.
Right.
Now, look, serious people would say it's got to be mentioned. It's the biggest problem. If you care about spending, 2/3 of our expenditures are just mandatory spending. Go out the door without any debate whatsoever. We grandstand on these pennies on the dollar discretionary spending. And, it makes everybody feel good. Like our conservative websites love it, but they're being dishonest too. And you got to talk about this stuff. And there's a way to win these debates. You got to trust people a little bit with some information and truth. And we've never really tried. And the Democrats would be vicious on those particular issues, but I talk about it a lot. I've never been destroyed for it, but because I also talk about it in terms of intergenerational conflict. That's what this is. Your Democrats want to tax my younger generation more and transfer that money immediately to the elderly. Now, we want to have a safety net, but is it, if you're going to fix the problem with this, is it really moral to tax people who have not had a chance to have a family yet, not had a chance to build their business yet? Their savings are in the tank. They've lived through now a couple different at least one major financial crisis, as soon as we graduated college. COVID wasn't exactly kind to us, wasn't kind to anybody, but the point is, there's, if you don't know anything about a person, except for their immutable characteristics, the best indicator of their wealth is going to be their age. So this is a real basic question, a really basic policy question to ask about who you should be taking from and giving to. And that should be an adult conversation that Americans can have. We have not proven that we have the ability to have it. But I'm not so sure our leaders have really tried either. But I've always been kind of passionate about the entitlement reform problem. You have to talk about it, and you got to immediately push back against the Democrats' lies. We're just going to take it out. They're just going to take it away from you. That's not what we're saying. It's not what we're saying.
And you got to talk about it, like you said, in these kind of happy warrior, optimistic tones too. If you're going to talk about reform, you got to talk about giving people ownership. You got to talk about how that could so vastly benefit certain people. I wrote a book a while ago about free markets and women. And this is a really interesting thing. We've got a social security system that was devised in the 1930s for single owner households.
Mhm.
And single worker households. And that means that if you're the second worker, which by the way, most women are, that system was never designed to help you. And that's why we have all these weird rules about, and by the way, women live longer, by the way, but that system is not in any way benefiting them. If you had an entirely different social security system, one in which people had ownership in it in some way and recognized their contributions out there, and in one way or another, that would be much better for different categories of people. And you can go through free market policies down the road and how that helps different constituencies in different ways. But we fundamentally have a bunch of systems in this country that were designed for a world that does not exist today. And we need to recognize that and embrace the new.
I agree with that. Well, some good advice. Good advice for Republicans, Kim. Appreciate you. I know I've kept you a good 15 minutes past what we promised.
It's fun.
It was a good conversation. Thank you for everything you do at the Journal.
Thank you.
It's very much appreciated and needed in this day and age. So thank you.
Keep fighting the good fight.
Will do. We will.
Take care.
All right.
Bye.
Bye, Kim. Thanks.